I think it's going to be a bit controversial, and I'm glad that Sarah is sitting down there, because I'm going to say some things that are almost the opposite of what she's further away than a punch can resolve. But I think you'll see an interesting progression from from Sarah's presentation to the various examples that we use, and Betty's really in the middle. Let me start where I almost always started, talking about my own personal values, and I assume that many of these are shared by you in this room, or you might not be here. But the first is that I think we got to improve education, and I think we can improve education. There's a lot of complacency in the idea that if I could only have less students, and if there were only more better students, and if this and if that, then I would be able to our students would learn better. I think it's our responsibility to engineer, to develop, to constantly improve our education. The second thing is, I think that student control is way more important than it used to be, because they have so many more options. They have to be empowered to use those options and use them effectively. And thirdly, I think education is too expensive. The continuing education opportunity is a basic human right. It's not only expensive in terms of money, it's expensive in terms of time that it takes for students to have to devote an opportunity cost to not being with their families or doing jobs or other activities. So all of these things are, I think, driving us to develop more effective systems. And John Daniels said years ago, that the demand for higher education would require us to be opening 2 new universities of 50,000 students every week, just to meet the current demand, let alone the population growth. And we are not going to do that in traditional campus-based universities. It is just not going to happen. So we have to think about how can we, do a different model or a different design. And some of these designs are very challenging for the role of the teacher in particular. And so I'm going to push the boundaries on that and talk about, how important is the teacher and what is the teacher's role really in student learning. So 3 drivers for change: new demands of the knowledge society. All of the speakers today have talked about that. New expectations of students. I think that they're not complacent. They're not consumers of product distributed to them. They're much more savvy, and they have more options, as I said. And of course, the new technology and the opportunities. But oftentimes, as Farron said, we have the same institutional models. Only we have even less public resources than we had 5-10 years ago. So I'm going to talk a lot about how these tools work, but again, these tools are not particularly new. We've always had a telephone, now we call it Skype. We've always had paper and pencil, now we call it WordPress, and Foursquare and Pinterest and YouTube and all these other sorts of things. So you can see that we have some familiarity. It's not like these are total new worlds. It's just that they have very new affordances that make them very interesting. And I think as teachers and ourselves, we have to build on the tools of the past so that we can better handle these ones in the future. And when you talk about education cost and learning, in distance ed, there's always a big push on interaction. And how important it is for learning, how expensive it is, what kind of interaction. And the definition I like from Wagner, reciprocal events, that's 2 things interacting with each other that require 2 actors, 2 actions, and the interactions occur when these objects and events mutually influence each other. So I think that's what an interaction, it can be between students. Well, I'll get to that. And those interactions lead to connections. And the nice thing about Wagner's earlier definitions is it doesn't say that interactions are only between people. You can have an interaction with a machine, with content, with media, and sometimes that can be much more effective. And what my talk today is about is how to decide what really needs human interaction, what really needs teacher interaction, and what can be substituted by other means that are cheaper and more scalable. And these are 2 ideas from connectivism, which the creation of artifacts that Betty was talking about and making them public are key tenets. But the idea is that we use these interactions to make connections that we can build upon in the future and that help us solve problems today. And George Siemens is often saying that learning may reside in non-human applications. I'm not sure I go for the learning, but certainly knowledge and information can reside there. So the big three in distance education literature is learner content, learner instructor, learner learner. There's been many studies about those three and how you shift them around, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. I wrote a paper a long time ago, just added the three others, is that there's also teacher-to-teacher interaction. That's community of practice and how important that is for teachers to be constantly learning. And then teachers interacting with content, and that's our OER production and sharing of content, again, that Betty talked about. And then finally, in a semantic web, we're starting to see content interacting with other content. And you see that with Google search engines always updating, no interhuman interaction, or remote sensors picking up temperature data and all that sort of thing, webcams, all that sort of stuff. So there's this interaction world has, in a sense, become a little more complicated, but it's also given more opportunities. And way back in 2003, I wrote an article called Getting the Mix Right, again, an updated and theoretical rationale for interaction. And this article sort of sat, I don't think anybody read it for at least 5 or 6 years. And then there was a meta-analysis done based on it, and they started to say, yeah, there's something here. And so now I seem to get hits all the time on it. So if nobody reads your paper the first decade, don't worry about it. I developed this equivalent, interaction equivalent theory, gave it the Anderson's interactive equivalency, fancy name. And the first thesis was that if you got one of these three at a high level, student, teacher, student, student, or student content, then for many people that's enough. And that the people can learn, people have learned in the past from just high levels of one of those three. The second thesis says that it might be more satisfying, and the students and the teachers might like it more, but it'll probably always cost more to add extra, to add the other two in. And so we have to get the mix right, not only the quality that we always talk about, but the affordability that we should be talking about for more of our students. So a colleague of mine, Terumi Miyazoki from Japan, she and I have been working together on this equivalency theory, and she always started thinking of it as a rubric cube. And you know how hard it is to get them so they line up exactly right. But if you can think about those big three, student content, student learn, and student content interaction, student learning, learner, student to student interaction, and student teacher interaction. And as the first thesis says, you get one of them at a high level, you can create an effective learning experience. And so just get one of those at a high level and you'll be all right. Here you can see that you get more satisfaction because you've got a lot of student content interaction, but you also have a lot of student teacher interaction. And again, that might lead to increased interaction, probably will actually, but is it cost and time efficient? And then you can start displaying them this way. Here's three examples of instructional designs. The one over here on A is like a MOOC. There's a lot of student content interaction. There is zero student-teacher interaction, and there is variable amounts of student-student interaction. And what has happened in most of the classic, at least the American MOOCs to date, is that they use video camera to capture the student-teacher interaction. They can it, and they turn it into student content interaction so that it becomes scalable. And you can say, well, it's not the same as having a loving teacher in the room. And it isn't. But you can watch a movie and it's not the same as sitting in the room with a famous actor. But you can still, you can exchange human feelings with them, and you can learn from them, and you can engage with them at a level. So obviously this the model A there is the most cost effective, and we see that today in the MOOCs. There's questions about, and I'll get back to the question Sarah raised is, are students autonomous enough to study in a MOOC or not? And I think her conclusion was that they're not self-autonomous learners. The question raises to that is, whose fault is that? Are we training our students to be autonomous learners? And if we're not, and it's really hard, because if we teach them to be self-autonomous, maybe we won't have a job anymore, or our job will be vastly different than what it was before. So it could be a bit scary. This number B here in the middle, we got $6 signs before. This is a common classroom thing, is that the student content interaction is expensive textbooks and videos, and you know, it's not cheap. Then student-teacher interaction, we talked about, you know, like how many people can you get into a classroom and what's the most effective. So it has cost. And then the student-student interaction, people talk about how wonderful a student-student interaction in a classroom is. But if you go into most lecture theaters, there's not really very much of it, but there's certainly potential for student interaction. And over in the extreme right, you can play with models where you talk about student-student interaction being very high with collaborative work experiences, and that might not cost much money, but they often cost a lot of time. So I guess I'm just challenging you. I don't know what the right mix of all of these are, but we have options, and I think we have to really, as Farron said in the first talk, is what do the students need, what do they want, and what can they afford, and trying to get the mix right. So we have content, which was correspondence lessons that Sarah talked about in the first generation of distance education. Then we have the classroom experience, student-teacher interaction high, and then we have the student-student learning interaction. But they're all leading now to a big focus on content. And if you think of think of how you learned the last thing you learned how to do, whether, like I had to fix our washing machine the other day, and I thought, I better phone somebody up. And then I thought, I'm too cheap to phone somebody up, and I can probably fix this. So I went on YouTube, punched in Maytag washer spinning, and bang, there was 8 different videos showing me how to fix that washing machine. So for $1.50, I fixed that machine. And so to suggest that students always learn by teachers, well, there can teachers maybe, but you don't have to have a real-time interaction with the teacher any longer. But it might be good for some people, and it might be necessary for other people. But getting the balance right, I think, is a real challenge for all of us, and probably going to get harder. So here's looking at, and one other item, is this is if you add not only the dollar signs for the cost, but what about the time? How much time does it take for a student to learn, or a teacher to teach, or to work with content? And you see over here on number F is the only one I'm really going to talk about. But this is, again, back to the MOOC model with 0 real cost, or it can be paid by advertisers perhaps. But what students are starting to do now is they're starting to say, okay, there's a lot of content here, whether it's on YouTube videos or books or anything. And they're starting to stress getting in meetup groups, either face-to-face or online, or starting, you know, to regenerate study group kind of thinking, and to try to, you know, get people to start being responsible for each other's learning. And People's University, a startup in the US, it advertises itself as the world's first free tuition online university. And the first course that every student takes in that is how to help other students in your course. You don't pass that course, you don't go on in the course. And then they get volunteers, and they get content from open education resources. And they're really trying to invent a model of higher education that is affordable and can be exported around the world. So this is John Daniels, very famous in distance ed talk. He called it it's Daniels Triangle. I can't remember the name he put. The iron triangle, because you can't get out of it. He says that if you want to have high quality and high accessibility, you will have high cost. There is no doubt about it. Or if you want to, you know, have low cost, then either quality or accessibility has to suffer. You're sort of in a box. But now I think with content becoming so much less cheaper by orders of magnitude, including student-generated content, that we're starting to see that what's really is in the triangle is time. time for students, time for teachers, and quality and cost. And trying to mix those, it's maybe a new iron triangle, but I think that we have to start thinking about a world where content is ubiquitous, but I guess not take it for granted either, but think that we are getting public money and it's our duty to put content out there, but to use it as well and to be contributors to that community. Yeah. So we have the big thing of content, we have the mentors, the peer resources, and we have these meet-up communities. Now this is what's happening right today in informal learning. If you want to, say you want to become an expert on Warcraft, what is it? Oh man. Yeah, the game. Yeah, you don't go to a teacher, you don't enroll in a course, you study all the tactics online, you have discussion groups, and you play the game. So and this is what's happening in informal learning, and we're starting to see that opportunity emerge in higher education and formal learning, where the content from everywhere is being used. These classrooms are now becoming more virtual, and the tutors, teachers, subject matter, co-workers, relatives, mentors, we can start to sort of build our learning communities ourselves. So Terumi and I have built this site, the Interaction Equivalency website, and we're listing all the articles and sort of rejections and talk about this site. So if you're interested in the interaction equivalency theorem, you're welcome to go there and contribute. So just a schmaltzy quote from Forrester, 1910, "Only connect." That was the whole of her sermon. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer, only connect. So that's what the interaction does. But I've just challenged us to think, what is the appropriate brand? And not to pick on Sarah any more than I already have, but we talked about the argument that we discovered last year, that in the master's course at the MOOC, they have courses that have 60 or had 60, 70, 80 people in them. And as Sarah said, the conventional wisdom around the world, as far as I know, is that 25, 30 students is it, then the quality ends. But then the question is, have the people here in UOC, have you found a way to scale that all the rest of us haven't? And maybe we're just at the verge of finding out how to work with much larger numbers. And so the question is, the only way you can resolve that is you can't talk about what the literature says, and you can't talk about how wonderful it is, but you need data. You need to have some evidence to suggest that is it working, and what's the cost on students, what's the cost to the teachers, and it might not be perfect. It'll sort of like be the Ryanair. It's not the best travel experience that one could ever imagine, but it gets you to the other destination. And if we only had first class travel, how many of us would be on the airplane, So I think there's room for all kinds of different models, and let's not forget our value, I think, is to be more effective and to do a better job of teaching and learning. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.